Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Thom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Well, welcome everyone to the Bagel Logic Podcast, and as promised, I have a fantastic guest. And before I let him speak, I'll just give him a little bit of an introduction and tell you my reasoning for having him on the podcast. His name is Sky Sands, and Sky, boy, what a renaissance guy, as they like to call people that have multiple talents. Comedian, actor, magician, writer, entertainer. We'll talk a little bit about that. Creative food technician, motivational speaker, and paper folder. And actually, we personally met over his paper folding because Sky used to come into a place that I taught special education, and he would teach my students how to do origami, and with varying degrees of success because, you know, special education is a different world. But even before that, I graduated from, well, I didn't graduate from Brighton High School. I attended Brighton High School. I eventually, I dropped out, and we've talked about that in previous episodes. But I grew up in Brighton, and Sky was always a kind of a larger-than-life figure in the Brighton community. And everybody knew who he was, and then I went on to work at Red Creek, which is a bar in the Rochester area, and he came through there and did comedy and everything. So our paths have crossed a lot throughout the years, and I've just always enjoyed talking to him. Every time I see him, he has a great attitude. He's a lot of fun. And when I asked him to be on the podcast, I was over the moon that he said yes. So with all that incredible introduction, Sky, thank you so much for being on the Bagel Logic Podcast.
Oh, Tom, my pleasure. Thank you. Oh, stop it some more. All the nice things. My pleasure. It's nice to hear your voice, and it's nice to talk again. And you name it, anything. And yes, I've done all that stuff and a whole lot more. Just stuff that you don't even know about, like being an EMT or a delivery person or Ronald McDonald. I mean, there's been so many different jobs in my career. But it's always been while I'm doing the comedy and the magic and the entertainment education kind of thing, like you. And one more thing with the paper folding, the origami. It's interesting because I remember telling the kids, no, we don't cut paper in origami. We just fold it so you can put that knife away.
Yeah,
they were a little tough.
Yeah, they were tough. I mean, we had some. It was as I said, with varying degrees of success. But I really enjoyed the patience that you had, and I think it in situations like that, I'm sure you'll agree that sometimes it's not even about the teaching. It's just about spending time with kids and letting them know that you appreciate and care about them. And in special ed, I've always felt like special ed students should be treated the same as any other student. And when you do that, they really kind of connect with you. And I felt you made some really good connections there.
I enjoyed it. And the interesting part is that I'm not that far from being a special ed student and that's how I feel. And I say that because my learning was a little off. And basically it's because I was a round peg in a square hole. Actually, I was a square peg in a round hole. Now, I was a triangular peg in a round hole. That's better because square sounds square. And it wasn't a good fit. School and I learned differently, and I call it connect the dot thinking. One in my head, one doesn't go to two, doesn't go to three. One goes to 15, later to 7, back to 4. We'll connect the dots. It'll make a picture. Until then, come along for the ride. Color it later on your own. And it'll never be the picture we thought it was going to be. It's looking like an elephant and it's a tree. But that's how I think. And it's not an affectation. It's just my mind is, again, some of my friends used to call me lefty because I'm not right. And I thought that was cute, but you know what? They were right on the money. They were on the money. They were on target.
Well, yeah, I find that very interesting because, as I said, growing up in Brighton, I mean, your name was, even at a young age, I mean, people knew who you were. And I always originally was introduced to you as a magician. I mean, was the thing that you started out with. The comedy came later because I remember when you came to Red Creek, as I mentioned, and you were doing the comedy and the magic, at that point, you were doing more comedy and a little less magic. And I was kind of like, wow, I thought this guy was a magician. But I was really impressed at how adept you were at taking that magic skill and turning it into comedy.
Well, I started when I was a little kid. I I used to magish when I was younger, which is a good thing that I wasn't a wizard. But I used to do the magic, and then I realized I wasn't that mysterious. And my name is Sky, short for Skylar. I was the shortest kid going into my like sophomore, junior class. I was short, not the shortest, but I was short, and I had red curly hair. And I used to say my parents should have just named me Beat Him Up Till He's 16. So instead of doing that, the magic at least got a chance for me to be different in a good way. And then I was the class clown. I don't think I got the attention at home. Parents were divorced, issues. So I did the magic, and it was always about, like George Carlin said, class clown, dig me. And I started doing that, and I was doing shows for pay. I mean, for kids' birthday parties since I was probably 10 or 11. And I remember doing a kids' party where the kids were bigger than me. And the mother came down the stairs, how's everyone doing? And they're all holding me down, beating on me until I would teach them how I did my trick. Bad gig. And then I started doing the comedy. And then at one point through my career, I stopped doing the magic because the other comedians were busting my chops, saying, hey, he's a prop comic. He's doing magic. Because there's a hierarchy in comedy. And I'm not going to get this correct, but it's something like this. There's the stand-up monologist. And then there's things like the person who does song parodies. Then below the song parodies is the person that does juggling. And underneath that is the magician. And underneath that person is the guy that does just props, then impressions. Then underneath that would be clowns. Underneath that, ventriloquists, and the last final bottom line is mimes. And it's interesting because all that's changed. I mean, Jeff Dunham, ventriloquist, kick butt. Red, Carrot Top, doing great in Vegas with his props. So I remember I stopped doing the magic at one point, and I had a club owner. It was in Fort Lee, New Jersey, a place called Bananas, a comedy club. And he said, where are the toys? Where's the magic? And I said, well, the other comics are busting my chops, and I don't think I wanted just to do this. And he said, listen, I am at no shortage for white stand-up monologists. I need something different. You're like vaudeville on the stage. You're like Sesame Street. Boom, boom. If you don't like something, it's different 10 seconds later. So that's what's always been my niche, is to be different. And now I don't even have to try. I tell people, you caught me on a good day. I'm without my medication. And I joke about it, but really it's just free form. A lot of it. I mean, there's a script. There's an outline of stuff that works, but the skeleton gets a different body every show, depending on what it is. See, and again, here we go around all over. So yes, I started as a magician and went into comedy.
Yeah, well,
wow.
One of the things that you said there that kind of struck home with me. You said it's a good thing I'm not on my medication. Now, I at one point in my life, I was going through a divorce. They put me on this stuff called Zoloft, and I literally just was completely tapped of all kinds of creative energy or anything like that.
Oh, you wuss.
And you know what? I've always, and it's interesting, I've had this conversation with other people as well, that as hard as it is sometimes to have very scattered thoughts, and, I said I do 8 or 10 different things and whatnot, that's a part of who I am. And you know what? But there's times where I fought that, and it's kind of, I mean, it was that statement I know was sort of rolled up into a whole lot of other stuff. But has that ever happened? Well, I mean, you mentioned that you kind of fought the magic thing or whatever. Do you ever fight like you're doing 85 different things and maybe just try to settle on one or two?
Oh yeah. All the time. It's almost like my head. People don't know what a Rolodex is anymore, but it was one of those things that holds the business cards and your contacts, and it was on a wheel, and you'd spin it to get your contacts. And to me, it was always like spinning the Rolodex. It would be like trying to pick a card while you're riffling the deck and they're flying by you. Probably for around 10 years, I didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. No exaggeration. So then they had me on Ambien. And it really didn't slow me down, but it made me very edgy the next morning. Then we tried Zoloft. That's why I said, you wuss. And it really didn't. I was afraid it was going to take my edge away, but it really didn't. Now I do some other medications I suffer from, and I'm very open about it, although I'm pausing right now. So obviously I'm kind of hesitant. But I'm open. I suffer from depression. My lows can be very low. And there's anxiety involved. and it's just what is. It's part of me. It's what is, and I've accepted it. It's just like if I said I had a different kind of affliction physically, no one would make any comment about it. But because it's depression, people think, oh, okay, that's all right. No, I'm fine. I go through waves, and I can be talking, be as happy as a clam, and I'll look out the window, and all of a sudden I'm just down. So it's not a question of being depressed. People think being depressed is just being sad about something. It's a chemical thing. It's just my body is different. Plus, I always wonder, and I'm not making this up. I stood behind a guy once. He was hitting a baseball that was on a rope in his house. He roped up this thing to practice. And one day I went behind him. He didn't know it, and he hit me in the head with a baseball bat, knocked me right out, bam, on the ground. And I always wondered if that had something to do with my thought process, if that did anything inside. But yeah, I go all over the place, and sometimes I have to just say, enough. And that's where I've been right now. I'm very, very Zen centered, very Zen. Or if I talk to you like this, then I can get more into that tone. And I do. I've been making recordings now. I'm going to start putting them out for people with relaxation exercises and tapes before you go to sleep. But that's not how I mean, like when I was Ronald McDonald, I talked a lot higher because you can't be Ronald and say, "Hey kid, how are you?" So it's all about the energy, the voice. And now after we talk, I'll be down. I'll be quiet for a long time.
Yeah, I'm wondering, you mentioned before we went on the air, you mentioned your wife. Now, my wife is a polar opposite of me. She's super quiet. She's very introverted, but it really helps balance me out. And I think some of my friends are that way too. It's almost, sometimes it's difficult to be around some like-minded individuals, even though you need that. And I'm glad you mentioned the stuff about depression because obviously, being that I was on Zoloft, I deal with it all the time too. But I think people look at guys like us and go, man, this guy's always talking of doing 18 different things. He's a writer, he does podcasts and all that. He can't be depressed. I mean, what's he got to be depressed about? He's so super hyper all the time. But yeah, I mean, my wife, I know we talked about pets too. I mean, pets kind of have always helped balance me out.
Just to interrupt. And what it is also, when you say the hyper, we're hyper creative.
Yep.
We are hyper creative. And if you tell people, and my wife always says that now hear me out. My wife says I'm a genius. Whether it's what I remember, the trivial stuff, things I figure out, you can call it whatever you want. I call it hyper creative. Because we are into different things, all different things. We're good at a bunch of them. Some of them I'm not so good at, and I'll be the first to admit it. But that's just the way we're wired. I make no excuses for it anymore.
It's so, it's so interesting. I've never thought about it until this second, but I mean, think about how hyperactivity was such a pejorative. I mean, even as a kid, I mean, that was like one of the first things that parents would look for medication or assistance with. I mean, even as drastic as lobotomies back in the day, if a kid was, hyper, I mean, it's such a negative connotation, but you're right. Putting it in that perspective, I think is very important. Hyper creative, your mind is just always worrying, and either you gotta run with it, or it'll eat you alive.
That's right. And it does get to you. Like right now I'm looking across my room. I've got a couple of guitars there. I've got a big puppet over there. I've got two puzzles over there. I have a bottle over across the room that I see a weight hanging on the inside. And I try to get the weight moving with my mind. It's a psychic test, but it's just what is. When I was a kid, first of all, I was tired of all my life, I've always been told, slow down. And it gets annoying because I can't. And that's like telling someone to stop breathing when you're in this position. And I remember at one point, I was getting some headaches, but also because I was hyper. They put me on this pill, and no one took pills back then. They just punished you. It was just like it was a behavioral problem. And they put me on this thing, and my mother went to school and said, he may be falling asleep during class. It's going to take time to get used to. And probably 3 days later, I was standing Brighton Middle School on a ledge outside the window and said, hello there, see you in a minute. And I took a step backwards so that I would fall straight down like a cartoon. I don't want to look like I was falling. I wanted to go straight down. And the kids laughed. It was funny. My mother got called. I sprained my ankle, but it looked good. And that was what it was all about back then. It was never about the hokey pokey.
Oh my gosh. Was Mr. Collins the vice principal back then? Because I used to have some amazing run-ins with that guy.
Real quick, this is also a good story. I got sent, he was there, but he was a teacher when I was a kid. I got sent to the principal once because for a project, we had to do a presentation. And one of my presentations, once was I was getting out of a straitjacket, and I talked about the life of Houdini and all of these different facts, Eric Weiss. One time I said, my presentation today is I'm going to bring the dead back to life. And what I did was I brought a fly in at the beginning, and I showed 2 containers, and they both had cotton and a screen that I actually had the fly under the water, dead. So when I was doing the presentation, I lifted the fly out and I put it on a piece of blotter paper, no, not that kind, a piece of paper that dried the fly out underneath a lamp. And so by the time I was probably 15 minutes into my talk, the legs were all sticking straight up. It wasn't waterlogged anymore. It looked like a regular dead fly. And then I sprinkled a powder over it and held my hands over and just did this like energy work. And then the fly turned over off its back and started licking its legs and walked. It didn't quite fly, but then it walked away. And so they sent me to the principal saying that I was, doing some kind of, I don't want to say voodoo or anything like that, but the word I'm looking at, I can't, like occult stuff, Satan worship. And the principal asked me, what's going on here? So I said, look, the fly is never dead. The fly is wrapped up with its wings and there's a little bit of air in there, but it's basically waterlogged. The magic powder that I have that my grandfather gave me so many years ago, it's table salt. And if you put table salt on a wet fly, it's going to draw the moisture out and the fly is just going to get up and go. So it made for a great presentation, but it got me, believe it or not, that got me in a lot of trouble in school. And that's where I started getting the rep of, this kid's pretty cool, bringing the dead back to life.
Wow, that's, it's why, I mean, I went to Brighton Middle School. 12 Corners Middle School was the proper name. And I could see that. I mean, it was a very interesting community that we grew up in. And
Mr. Carlavati was my principal.
Carlavati. Yeah. I think I remember Mr. Palazzolo was probably, maybe he was the guy that took over afterwards. But I've always found that Brighton, New York, which is a suburb outside of Rochester for those people listening and that don't live near the area, was a pretty progressive town, though. I mean, I felt that on some level, even though there was definitely some hierarchy and a lot of the preppiness, you had to wear the alligator shirts and you could get picked on and stuff like that, it still felt like it was a fairly diverse and progressive community compared to some of the other ones I've lived in later.
It was. It was and it is. What's interesting is, yes, there was a preppy in school, there were the preppy kids, the athletes, the hard guys, the theater people, the nerds. I came from a poor family because when my family moved to Brighton, my mom and dad were married. My sister and I were there. And then they split up. And then my father just split. No child support, really. No alimony. And then he would touch back in once in a while and try to play father. But it was terrible. So I would be wearing like hand-me-downs that my mom's friends' kids would have. So for me to ever wear an Izod shirt, that's probably why I would never wear one when I could buy one. And when I was growing up, because people would say, wow, those are cool jeans. Where'd you get them? And you didn't want to say Gold Circle, or JM Fields or Kmart back then, in Brighton at least. And when you wore Levi's, for some reason back then, people were trying to pull the red tag off. It was cool to take the red tag off the Levi's. And when I got my first pair of Levi's, don't touch the red tag, man. I was proud that I could actually afford and wear a pair of Levi's. So it's a cool place. I don't think there's a stigma anymore because stigma anymore is like it used to be as far as that goes because it's so diverse.
Yeah, it's funny we recollect. I mean, you bring up things that I totally forgot about, like people trying to pull the little red Levi tag off, or then when J.C. Penney had the knockoff brand, I think it was like Plain Pocket it didn't have a thing, and if you wore
Right.
Wranglers, you were kind of in a lower class and everything. And I always remember that song by Rush, Subdivisions, and in some ways I felt that encapsulated a little bit of the Brighton experience. But again, in looking back in a more at being a little bit older, I think I appreciate some of those experiences because, again, there did seem to be a pretty decent cross section of different cultures and things like that, and even kids bust in from the city that you didn't necessarily see on some of the outer suburbs.
Well, and I will say, busted. One was, all right. So I was 15 and I was still wearing Toughskins. I wasn't wearing Toughskins. When I was a little kid growing up, because my dad wasn't around, for some reason, my mom thought it was really cool to get me like this cool mod clothing. Because I'm at that age where, it was just, there were some bright colors, there were some cowboy boots. Oh, if I could do it over again, just give me a t-shirt and jeans. But she dressed, again, it was just pretty crazy. But that helped me become me now. So, and here's one now. So I'll take this now to my own step. When I was in high school, I got a job. I was 15 years old, and I would go to work after school first to clean up at a bakery. And I would clean up what the baker left there during the day. Then, starting, I think, in my sophomore, junior year, I would go before school, 3:34 in the morning, and I would be the baker's assistant. So I baked, listen to this, all the bagels. I baked the bagels, all different kinds. And then after I baked, I would get to school, became popular then because I smelled good. I smelled like a bagel, and then would bring the bagels to school. And then I'd go back after school and clean up. So I have a connection there with the bagels with you. And I've boiled my hand. I've steamed my hand for not taking my hand out of the oven, wearing a wet mitt for a while, but loved it. It was a big part of me and growing up and giving money towards the bills for my mom and my sister.
Yeah, I mean, bagels were a very important part of my life growing up too, and that's why, I mean, when the pandemic started, I started a small bagel business, and everyone's always amazed that that I was able to pull it off. But I think when you're around bagels a lot, you know what a good one is. But man, I mean,
right.
we'd have pizza bagels for lunch every day, and all that kind of stuff, and
Yes.
it was
Yes.
just. I don't know. It's the ultimate comfort food on some level, and I think
Sure.
I think you and I were probably spoiled in that we weren't in New York City, but dang, we had access to some incredible bagels in Brighton, and I assume they still do.
And I used to work at New York City Bagels, that was in Brighton, that became Brownstein's. And I also used to work at Bagel Land. So, I mean, I was working with the best in the city. It was great. It was a lot of fun. And to this day, I learned whenever you go to a place that has either bagels, donuts, anything that you're going to put items, you always tell them how many you're going to get first. I'm going to be getting 8 things, or I'll be getting 4. This way they know which frickin' bag or box to grab. Because, they stand in line and then they're like, I don't know. So, yeah, that's one thing it carried with me.
Yeah, New York City Bagels was we always kind of vacillated between the two. It's like you go to Bagel Land for a little while, you be like, I think we'll try New York City, and they were very distinct bagels. I think that was kind of cool too. But we never did answer the question: is your wife your opposite, or is your wife?
Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, no need to apologize.
My wife is amazing, because at first everyone thinks I'm the funny one, and she's a little bit quieter and serious. The two of us together, I personally think she's funnier. I think she's very, very funny, very fast, very smart, very witty, very talented. She's an artist. And in many ways, she's an artist. And when I bought her engagement ring, I'm a Mayberry kind of guy. When I lived where I did live, by the way, you would know this. My first home was not growing up, but when I got married, I moved back to Brighton behind Monroe Hardware. I was just in this place called the Roselawn area. And I would ask the neighbors, I'm going to the store. There was an elderly lady. Can I get you anything? I mean, that's what we did. We shoveled each other's sidewalks. sidewalks. Nowadays, people don't do that. When I bought her engagement ring, it was really, I thought, cool looking ring. Well, it was too old fashioned looking for her. She ended up later, many, many years, having a. But I'm the old farty traditional guy in many ways, and she, though you wouldn't know it, is just, well, you wouldn't know it back then. We get together great. I mean, we work together now on and off, for 30 years. We've been together for around 33. And even today, her day off and my time off, and we spent the day together in the studio and laughed a lot. And God, am I lucky. I'm so lucky to last all the time.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And we're having some glitches. I don't know if it's on your end or my end. Are you seeing glitches on your end too?
I am seeing glitches on my end. And I washed. I can't believe they're on my, no, I know I've seen things on my screen, but I'm literally 10 feet from my modem and my hub. So stop it.
Who knows what's going on? It's the Russians, darn it.
Hey, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
This is what editing is for, to pull this stuff out. But so you mentioned about your wife, and I'm glad that you said all the things that you did. It's funny. I don't know if you ever run into this situation with your married friends that'll say stuff like, if you want to go out or something, and you always say you want to take your wife with you. Like, I'm one of those guys that they go, "Hey man, let's go out." I'll be like, "Yeah, I'll bring my wife along." They're like, "Why would you want to bring your wife along?" And I've always thought to myself, why would you want to be married to somebody that you wouldn't want to hang out with? I mean, we certainly do our own things, but at the end of the day, she's the person I want to spend time with if I'm going to go out and have some leisure time with. Even though my wife and I do the bagel business together, we've got all these things and whatnot, but I still just enjoy her company, and it's refreshing to hear that from another guy. Well,
it's interesting because she does understand me. She knows and I don't hang out with a lot of friends. I'm a very, very, when I'm off stage, for the most part, I'm a pretty private person. I was just going to get to something. Hold on, I derailed. I was going to tell you something. So I tell her, you want to tell her everything. She's my best friend. So I thought, what about this? Because they can sense when something's gone on. And I say the biggest argument my wife and I ever got into is when she didn't have the common sense to be able to read my mind. And that's and then that's one of the things I learned was ask for what you want, but don't demand it. One of the rules, prescriptions for happiness. And it was my fault. I wasn't communicating. But I thought, what if I go to Vegas? I mean, women just know things, but I'd want to tell her things. Like if Meg Ryan was out in Vegas when I was there at one time, and I could fool around, I'd want to come right home and say, "Hey, man, I did Meg Ryan." You're not. Or here's what would happen. She'd say, I wouldn't tell her. Let's just say I didn't. But I'd come home and she'd say, "Hey, how was your? Hey, something's going on here. I could sense it. Did you fool around when you were out there?" I can't lie to her. "Yeah." "Oh, really? Who was it?" I'd say, "It was Meg Ryan." My wife would go, "Cool. You did Meg Ryan?" But then she'd turn around and say, "Wow, well, how would you feel if it was Brad Pitt?" And I told her I wouldn't do Brad Pitt. But I say that all in joking because, yeah, my best friend. And I don't get that either. I never have said I gotta go home to the freaking wife. No, I'm lucky. Or when you see friends you haven't seen in a long time and they say, "Hey, are you still with so-and-so?" I don't say her name on out loud anywhere. I call her A, the letter A, but they'll say, "Hey, are you still with A?" Like it's such a common thing now not to be with the person that you were with for a while.
Yeah, it's tough. It's weird. I don't know. I mean, I was divorced, so my first marriage didn't have any of that. And I thought that, you said you came from a divorced family, so I think sometimes you look at your parents' relationship and you see the dysfunction and you can think that that's okay, or you do just the opposite. So right. I assume in your case, like me as a father, had a very different approach than my dad did. My dad was very distant, never went to soccer games or any of that kind of stuff. And then when I was a dad, I says, "You know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go to every one of those band concerts, even though I despise every note that's coming out of that squeaky trombone. But you get dividends when you do that."
Sure. You learned how not to be. And instead of focusing on how not to be, you focus on, well, this is how I want to be. I came from a very, very, I would say it was dysfunctional. My mom had her own issues. My father had his issues besides leaving, and he was a Marine. So it was amazingly, and he didn't go to my shows. My mother wouldn't see my shows or any of my plays. And the only reason why I stayed in high school was because of theater, and the plays, and English maybe, but that was, growing up that way, I decided, and how my father was with my mom, I realized that's not how I want to be as a husband. That's not how I want to be as a friend. And now I don't have children because the government doesn't want me to breed due to past behavior. But even now I'm an uncle to my wife's brother's children. I got that right. I had a sister who died when I was 25, she was 28. And anyway, so I want to be a good uncle too. And it's interesting that I said that about my sister, because I did the magic and the comedy, and then I auditioned to become Ronald McDonald, which I wasn't allowed to talk about for the longest time. But now Ronald has gone into the sunset, faded into the golden arch, so I can talk about him. But I was him for 5 years. And then when my sister passed, I gave notice that day because I realized I didn't want to be someone else the rest of my life. I don't want to get locked in. And that's why I do what I do now. And another thing, as long as I'm doing free form here, I was just talking about this with my wife yesterday. I am blessed because I do what I've always wanted to do. I'm a performer, an actor. I've done movies. I'm not blowing my own. Done all these things that I've always. But how is it in high school? They look at you in your sophomore year or going into junior and say, okay, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? Oh my God. How can you decide? I don't even know what I want to eat for dinner. You ask me to, no. So I've been very lucky that it's always changing. It's a work in progress still.
Yeah. As a high school teacher, I get that. I dropped out when I think the last grade I completed was 9th or maybe 10th. And I had a kid at a very young age. And then, I just focused on being a dad for a long time. So this is everything I've done since, the podcast, the bagels and all that. It's part of a midlife crisis. So, maybe I'll live to be 100. But, it's so strange, like you said, that you always hope that there's somebody that's going to give you some kind of direction or some kind of inspiration when you're in high school. But there comes a point where everybody's expected to do the same thing. And even when I went to college, when I was in my late 30s, you still had to take all those general education requirements that everybody has to take. So it's still cookie cutter, and I don't know. I talked with my sister the other day. It's interesting that we had a very different experience growing up, and she's an attorney now and everything. And she said, well, one thing I loved about Dad is that he instilled upon me, his daughter, that I could be whatever I wanted to be. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. Obviously, my experience would have been different because I was a male and I was the youngest, but she was the oldest. But I think sometimes schools don't necessarily foster that either, where they say, you know what, Sky, if you want to be the greatest comedian or magician, you can do it. They just say, no, you're from Brighton. Your expectation is you're going to go to a 4-year college and you're going to be a financial advisor or, work for the Federal Reserve. So it's kind of strange that way.
Yeah. Or a doctor. Right, or a doctor or a lawyer. It's if I would have gone to we have a school of the arts here in Rochester, and it's almost like what you see the kids that go to Fame, the TV show Fame or the movie. I'm dating myself again, but it's a performing arts school. Or if I would have gone to school without walls, a school that was just they thought differently, that probably would have been more of a fit. But I just wasn't into the formal education as I am not now. I'm a kinesthetic learner. I have to have hands-on. If I see something like origami, and I've had a TV show, I don't do as much origami anymore. I do, if you look online, I've done a lot of rock painting, which is really, you think it's like, oh, that's nice. It's rock, but no, it's pointillism, and it's very, very intense, very detailed. Anyway, if you show me, I'm pretty cool. If I have to hold hands at a 35-degree angle, forget it. I'm screwed. It's not going to work for me. Pictures are good. Live is good. And then once I can touch something, I'm all over it. So that's how I would learn. And you didn't get a lot to do with that kind of stuff. I like the stuff where you can get hands-on.
So,
sex ed. Oh, hands-on.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Feel good.
Sex.
I even studied that at home.
Yeah.
Even by myself. I love that stuff.
What's your comedy? If I remember correctly, you've always been a very clean comic. I mean, that's not easy either.
Well, no. When I started, especially, I've been doing this since many years ago. And I remember doing the Red Creek. The first time I did it, I was 16 years old. And my friend's mom came with us because it was the T-Max amateur hour. So with a parent, we could go. And I was doing magic. He was playing guitar, a buddy of mine. But then in the 80s, everyone was swearing. And I got to say, I was just off because if I do something, I commit. And I was over the edge. And then I realized I started to get the other shows besides the kids shows. And then Ronald, I was doing corporate shows. And they said, well, can you work clean? I went, of course I can. And it really was difficult. So I worked on it and came up with stuff. And now, honestly, it's so much easier. Instead of swearing, I could say, well, if something goes wrong, the defecation is going to come in contact with the rotating oscillator. Something like that. Or it's a bunch of acamoracus, which is actually an old word that's been phased out.
So I think we'll wrap it up. But honestly, Sky, I had a great time chatting with you. I think it definitely went some directions I didn't think it would go, and I appreciate your candor. I know that when we originally spoke about doing this, you said nothing is off limits, and indeed nothing was. But we definitely got to do this again. I would like to, and maybe next time I'll bring a remote recording out there and we can sit in person and face to face and drink a couple of sodas and, just enjoy each other's company now that the world is starting to open up a little bit.
I would love it. And next time, I'll boot everything down and up again so that even the router's fresh, everything. But I looked at it and I even I cleaned it today with a Windex and a rag. So I'm very happy. Very happy. But you know what? We will. And I look forward so much to doing this again.
No, I appreciate it. As I said, you were definitely a guest that I really wanted to get a hold of, and I think, as I mentioned at the outset, I love speaking to people that I've had great conversations with that I didn't record. So I think that probably comes across when we're actually have the mics on and everything. But and with that, obviously, listeners and everything, I just want to thank everybody for listening. The numbers are continuing to look good. If you could share and post some reviews and maybe do some magic or anything like that, anything to help grow the podcast, I would certainly appreciate it. And Sky, again, I think the coolest part of this whole thing is that we both, the show's Bagel Logic, and I think you got the concept because you grew up and worked in a bagel place, so you kind of could appreciate that.
Now,